Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. My name is Jason Jackson. I teach at MIT, and along with my mini conference, my Decolonizing Development mini conference, co-organizers Sasha White, Zophia Edwards, and Julian Go. I really want to welcome all of you, our panelists and audience members to our virtual roundtable on decolonizing development in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm so very excited to be here and to be having this conversation with all of you. Excuse me, with all of you. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, and I'm really excited for the conversation to come. I will just say right off the bat, also special thanks to Isa Cruxen, who I'll introduce along with other roundtable participants shortly, for all of her work in helping me to organize this specific roundtable. So Isa, thanks in advance, with many more thanks to come as we get going. So a very quick background. So the Decolonizing Development mini conference has been going on now for, I think this is going into the 4th year, if I'm not correct. It was launched by Julian Go and Zophia Edwards, and has grown tremendously over the course of the last few years. Myself and Sasha have joined more recently as co-organizers, and it's really done an amazing, I think, and this I can say as the sort of commenting from the outside before my own role as co-organizer now, job in sort of cultivating a particular kind of conversation, which I think is very unique to SASE. So thinking about socioeconomics broadly, so much more heterodox way of thinking about the relationship between economy and society, which SASE is very well known for, but more specifically also bringing in a kind of explicitly historical post-colonial perspective that really thinks about the role of coloniality, of empire, in shaping the trajectories of institutional change that have led us to our current moment in modern capitalism. So this particular roundtable, I think, is sort of exemplifies this sort of the idea behind the mini conference more generally, by bringing a conversation that focuses, on one hand, on decolonizing activities, both in the academy and in practice on the ground in Latin America and the Caribbean. Of course, the SASE conference, the physical conference this year will be held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And so it's particularly, I think, apt for us to have a kind of specific focus on the Latin America Caribbean region within the broader context of or broader intellectual and activist efforts to decolonize development. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our 3 panelists today. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, unfortunately, Jenna Marshall can't join us, but I will give a quick her bio as well, and I'll say a little bit about her work perhaps after their first round of discussion from the panelists that we have with us. Okay, so just going in alphabetical order, Dr. Carolina Alves, welcome, is currently Associate Professor of Economics at University College London, where she's affiliated with the Institute for Public Purpose. Prior to joining UCL, she was at Girton College at the University of Cambridge as the Joan Robinson Research Fellow in Heterodox Economics, excuse me, and a college teaching officer at the Faculty of Economics. Dr. Alves is co-founder of a group, Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, which is a network of economists working to promote inclusivity in economics, both in the academy as well as in the field's broader institutional structures. She's also a member of the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Advisory Group, which is a research initiative aimed at reinvigorating macroecon and bringing it back to the fore of policy-relevant social science, especially today, not just from our development challenges, but of course with the broader discussions globally around things like inflation and so forth. Finally, she's also co-editor of the Developing Economics blog, which takes a critical approach to creating discussion and reflection in the field of economics. So really excited to have you, Carolina. Thanks so much for joining us. Second, we have Isadora Cruxen. Isa is a lecturer in business and society at Queen Mary University of London. She studies the political economy of development with an interest in three core issues. First, the politics of market making and institutional change in global South contexts. Second, financialization and the politics of finance. And third, forms of social mobilization and participatory methods of research and planning. Her work explores these issues in the realm of urban infrastructure services, impact investing, water governance, and gender politics. She's also a research affiliate with the Data Plus Feminism Lab at MIT and co-leads a collaborative research project, Data Against Feminicide. I also very happily say that I've been very fortunate when Isa was at MIT to have the opportunity to work with her on her PhD committee, and I'm so excited to be able to continue to do that now that she's on the proverbial other side. So welcome, Isa, and thanks again for all of your help in co-organizing this roundtable. Third, we have Dr. Paula Serafini, who's a lecturer in the creative and cultural industries in the Department of Business and Society at Queen Mary as well. Prior to joining Queen Mary, she was a research associate at QMUL Research Institute for Culture and Media Economies at the University of Leicester. Dr. Serafini's work is in the field of cultural politics, and her research interests include extractivism, social movements and art activism, cultural labor, and socio-ecological transitions. Her research has been funded by, amongst others, the British Academy, and in 2023, her latest book, Creating Worlds Otherwise, received an honorable mention from the Visual Cultures Study, section of the Latin American Studies Association, LASA. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Serafini also has 15 years of experience working in and collaborating with the cultural sector. So welcome, Paula. Thanks so much for joining us. And then finally, just briefly, I'll mention our other roundtable member who couldn't be here, but as I mentioned, whose work I'll say a little bit about towards the end, which is Dr. Jenna Marshall, who's a lecturer in international studies at King's College in London. And before being at King's, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Kassel in Germany, and a Sassoon visiting fellow in Black and South Asia history at the University of Oxford. She currently serves as a co-convener of the Colonial, Post-Colonial, and Decolonial Working Group of the British International Studies Association. So with that, I thought I would just go ahead and we can get started. So what we'll do for the roundtable is begin just going in alphabetical order as introduced. So Carolina, if okay, we'll start with you. And we'll ask each of our roundtable participants to share their initial thoughts on the topic of the roundtable. I should also note that we circulated 3 questions to help animate the discussion, which I'll just sort of mention very quickly so that everyone has a sense, just to help guide our broader discussion. One was how, in the view of our panelists, what does it mean to decolonize development in the fields that they work in? Secondly, how we can think about decoloniality in relation to colonial and imperial histories in Latin America and the Caribbean generally, and in particular in the Latin American and Caribbean context in which each of our roundtable members work. And third, just asking for some examples of work that shows how we can decolonize development in practice through research and scholarship on one hand, as well as through socio-political engagements and collaborations that may extend beyond academia. So those are broad guiding questions that we will also use to animate our discussion as we continue on. Okay, so with all of that, Carolina, I turn it over to you. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you very much for being here, for inviting me to be here. I didn't know it has this roundtable and this mini conference is going on for over 4 years, so I'm even more honored to be here after learning that. And yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you, Isadora, for bringing me to this group. So I prepared something following let me just share it here with you, these 3 questions that Jason has just mentioned. And can you see, can you see there, or how is it going? No? Yeah, okay. So Oh, so what do I want to do? I will, oh, I have to make it bigger, right? Is it better? Yeah. Okay, so I will trying to address these three questions, of course, considering the field of economics. In the part of how I do that in my work, I will just mention at the end, but I think I'll leave this part for us to discuss more. Otherwise, just going to be me here talking about my work, and I want really to talk about decolonization in the field of economics as well, because I think this is important. So I tried to tackle this first question, what decolonizing development means in the field of economics, trying to think about how we understand reality and also how economics is as a discipline. And, in here, I'm not going to really go through what is the discipline of economics. I'm sure all of you have many critiques to the discipline of economics. I want to get from the 1930s onwards, where we see alternatives to the kind of classical political economy that is developing, and then also the more formalized and mathematized economics. So here you have Keynes, we have Schumpeter, and then we have the developmentalism, where I'm putting everything together, the structural, institutionalist, and political economy approach. And I'm sure all of you are much more familiar with that than me, but that is the last point that I want to try to bring to the discussion from the perspective of economics. We see that the development of the discipline of economics involves so many different processes and so on. But one thing that has got my attention when I start going through that journey of becoming an economist and also studying abroad, I'm from Brazil, and I had an education that was more pluralist, and also in a way much more we rely on theories that were developed in Latin America, and then once in the UK I realized how these theories were marginalized, and then I started to vary into that discussion of what's happening to the discipline, and I started thinking in terms of traditional methodologies that are Eurocentric, the ones that are not Eurocentric, and that's when I get into this discussion of decolonization in economics and in economics development. And the Eurocentric tradition for me is what is at key here, if I have to explain, how I understand the decolonizing development in my field. Sorry, just time here. And, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel here. I rely a lot on Samir Amin, his definition of Eurocentrism, Eurocentric understanding of development. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with that as well. So this is my starting point, is this idea of Eurocentrism that Samir Amin developed, which is the idea of how we understand capitalism and how we understand capitalism development. So I see, borrowing this from Samir Amin, I see that this Eurocentrism you see in economics and in development economics is this universalization of the European experience, but also of European capitalist development. So capitalism, our understanding of capitalism, to me, is at the center of when we're talking about Eurocentrism in development economics and in economics more broadly, because economists, we don't even discuss the historiography of capitalism, is a given. Capitalism is a given, or even worse than being a given is like the most efficient way to organize production through markets and et cetera. So, in a way, let's go back there. So in a way, to me, if we could think in terms of, the first question, decolonizing development in the field of economics, and the research perspective, I would see as approaches that are challenging that understanding of capitalism, that Eurocentric understanding of capitalism. Now, if I think in terms of the discipline, this is still at center, but we have to go back to, of course, how we understand development economics in the 1940s. And, many people, or as we are taught, we see, the starting of development economics in that context. Oh, sorry, something happened here. Yeah, but, to me, one thing that I've been trying to highlight more and more in my research and with my students is that actually, if you think about the origins of development economics, we go back, to this classical political economists that were seen as, the father of economics as a discipline. And, it's quite interesting to go back, for example, to Petty and how he understood this division of labor and capital, this transition from one socio-economic formation to other, and how William Petty was so involved with the English colonial administration, and most of his theory to understand the socio-economic formation was really based on a very biased and backwards understanding of indigenous population societies as being inferior and so on, and how England has this like civilizing mission and so on. And, so I find difficult to detach development from this colonial past. I think we have to highlight more and more and more what is development in economics and in economics discipline. So in that sense, I wouldn't go back to Truman by trying to highlight that the development of economics are actually born with colonialism for our contemporary moment, right? And again, I'm going, using a little bit side here to kind of frame my approach, and this kind of a dichotomy between modern and traditional, developed and undeveloped, how this is embedded in this colonial discourse that get mixed with the narratives about development and capitalism, and all this become positive, this idea of capitalism being this endogenous development process, where we have efficient allocation of resources, we have this technical progress and so on. In this, to me, the more I read, the more it takes me to colonialism itself and how development economics is actually born in that moment, if we really push the discussion. Even when you have the end of colonialism, we carry on this approach in many different ways, and that's what I'm going to try to go through a little bit, but very quickly, because this is something you probably know very well, that even when you start having alternatives after the post-colonial world, even if you look at this developmentalism, and some of the authors, I'll not mention all of them here, we still are attached to this idea of this dichotomy between development, underdevelopment, and so on, and without really explaining the structural changes we have there, or at least not structural changes, but not explaining the legacy of that, not only of colonialism, but how. So by default, the approach should be one that's anti-colonial and perhaps even anti-capitalist in that sense. So, just examples, Arthur Lewis here, this question of, economic dualism and et cetera, et cetera. And I think my point here is, yes, the developmentalists have a point, but they were not radical enough in terms of challenge capitalism and the relationship between capitalism and colonialism. So, at the time we are having these, I'm just checking my time. Yeah, these radical alternatives are happening, and it's interesting that radical alternatives happening actually in an active way through movements, through organization of conferences, to the idea of challenging the international economic order inside universities. We have this, the strong revival of Marxism around the post-colonial countries, and we know as well how many civil wars we have, and how especially England and France end up intervening in many of these countries that were fighting for independence, but also for a more radical take regarding, the understanding of their own country and sovereignty and so on. And one can ask, why these radical alternatives? And my understanding of this is that even when you start having the post-colonial developmentalism with many interesting authors such as Arthur Lewis and so on, we're still having this Eurocentric approach to capitalism development. I still see that this developmentalist project failed to break away from these colonial roots, this colonial intellectual apparatus. And that the consequence of this was that these more radical approaches, they become marginalized. And so to me, when you think about the discipline of economics and the relationship of this discipline with development and with approach to development, in the context of decolonization, it has to be, to me, it has to be that we have to go back to this more radical turn that was marginalized. And it was marginalized by different ways. I'm not going to go through all of this discussion, but from the IMF conditionalities to Cold War geopolitics, and you can go through that during the discussion. But the idea is this radical turn was marginalized at academia, but also at the activist level. And here is more historical events that contribute to this marginalization of this radical approach to development. So to me, if you have this radical approach to development, you're trying to move away from this, binary developed and underdeveloped. You're anti-colonial. You're, as I said, the more I read, the more I become like even anti-capitalist, or at least more critical to capitalism. And if you think in terms of these categories, we always will be in this very strict hierarchy when you're thinking about development, which makes the idea of being anti-colonial, from our perspective, very difficult. And you can discuss that more during the questions. I have some examples for a very recent paper using dependency theory and challenge this idea. So if you have this anti-colonial approach, if you have a more radical approach, even when you look at countries such as India and Taiwan that are taken as success countries in terms of high-tech sectors, you still can see how this dependency, how they have still a dependency regarding developed Western economies, and how this actually exacerbated in that context of high-tech sectors and so on. And again, we can come back to this. I'm almost finishing. So, to go to the last two questions, how then to think decoloniality in economics in the regions such as Latin and Caribbean. I hope I've been clear. I know I'm rushing a bit, but from my perspective, our theory or approach of methodology has to be anti-colonial. Now, what I see in academia is that the colonial, there is a typo there, that colonial scholarship is not political, is always staying in academia. And when you look at these radical alternatives flourishing at the 60s, most of them were very much involved with civil society or with protests, with resistance. So I see we have a privileged position in academia. So how we challenge this power dynamic around us and how we link our attempts to change curriculum, to change content to the dilemmas that people in the global south, they have been facing every day. And I want just to quote Robert L. Paula, which is a development economist from LSE, who says decolonization is political, is violent, and is not about maintaining the status quo. So I really like that. Now, that's the part I will end. So how I see that in my work, if you see the decolonizing economics and the decon, these are two, like how to challenge a discipline of economics, the Eurocentrism in a discipline. The book, of course, is more like academic. Then the decon is much more this activist kind of project. At the research level, because we have to publish paper, as all of you know, I try to I do macro finance and the question of Latin America in the global international financial monetary system. So I try to have a different framework to understand that. And I also trying to go back to this radical, do the critique of capitalism, what that means for economics, how we can bring macroeconomics with, for example, Marx economics and etc. So I try to, so yeah, there's the activism, there is the applied research, and there is the engagement with the discipline of economics. And that's it. I'm sorry if I went over time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carolina. That was great, and not over time at all. That was perfect. And really just to kind of highlight the kind of real challenges I think that exist in economics, even amongst the social sciences, and the amazing work that you and your colleagues are doing. So thanks so much for sharing that. Isa, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Carolina. That was really interesting, and I think resonates with a lot of the things that I plan to talk about as well. So first, I want to thank Jason for kind of providing the spark, kind of for us to put together this roundtable, and also thank Carolina, Paula, Jenna, who unfortunately couldn't be here, for agreeing to take part in this conversation. Which I'm really excited about. I think one of the things we wanted to do, right, Jason, when we were thinking about the panel was kind of bring together diverse fields and areas of work into conversation. And I think we've accomplished that in a really interesting way. It's an interesting space for me to like be coming into this conversation. I don't think I can claim to have thought as deeply about debates around colonialism and decolonization as Paula or Carolina have, for example, or Jenna for that matter. But I think what draws me into this conversation is an interest in interrogating and rethinking how knowledge is produced, or what we can think of the politics of knowledge production in itself. So for a long time, I've been interested in participatory forms of planning, democratic politics, and collaborative action-oriented research. And what this interest kind of bring to the fore is the need to destabilize hierarchies of expertise, to center lived experience and various ways of knowing, and to think through what kind of research we want to produce, with and for whom and towards what ends, right? And I think in my view, these kinds of concerns are also central to decolonizing or decolonial sensibilities and commitments. And this is where I think I enter into this conversation. So I situate my work kind of broadly in the political economy of development, but I think development is a subject of many disciplines and concerns a lot of different issues. So my own trajectory, I think, reflects a little bit of that, where I've come from political science and then into urban studies and planning and development studies. So I won't reflect on the question that we posed from a sort of field or disciplinary perspective, because that would be quite hard, considering all these different disciplines. But I thought I might approach it from this perspective of how we think about it from our research practice, from our methodologies, and the kinds of engagements that we co-create in the world, really, when we're trying to produce research that is more attuned to power asymmetries in knowledge production, and that is trying to advance alternative ways of understanding the world. So like Carolina did a wonderful job, I think, of situating the kind of a little bit of the history of development, particularly with relation to development economics, and noting that development has very contested meanings, also different meanings, from wide-ranging socioeconomic transformations to specific sets of institutions or actors, to concrete policy interventions or projects on the ground. But I think, at their core, these meanings tend to concern, as you know, very specific sets of countries, markets, populations, communities, which are construed as lacking development in some way, and thus become objects of development aspirations or interventions. In one of my areas of work, which is the politics of private investment in infrastructure such as water and sanitation, one of the ways in which this kind of construction transpires is a sort of anxiety and preoccupation from policymakers, development advisors, consultants, investors, with kind of ordering, quote unquote, markets in the global south that they perceive as lacking political stability, being too fragmented or unruly, and in a way perceived as too disorderly. Like in Brazil, for example, where I do much of my research and which is where I'm also from, many actors I've interviewed in the water space refer to the institutional architecture of water and sanitation provision as a sort of Frankenstein, a kind of a creature that they can't understand or make sense of, that has kind of been pieced together in a way that is unlegible to them. And I think their reference point when they're talking about this Frankenstein is typically Western European or Anglo-American market institutions that they perceive as more stable, more predictable, more desirable in some way. And indeed, there's always quite a bit of anxiety among some of these actors around how they might explain things that happen in Brazil, such as mayors not wanting to increase tariffs as per the contract. How they might explain that to the likes of the Canadians, quote unquote, or other foreign investors. Ironically, some of these are actually investors that have been in Brazil for decades, so they're not necessarily foreign per se or lack knowledge of Brazil, but those kind of constructions and perceptions are still there. And for me, what this kind of brings to mind is what Chandra Mohanty once referred to in Under Western Eyes as implicit reference, right? So Mohanty argued that it's through such implicit and sometimes explicit reference that power is exercised, that colonization occurs, particularly at a discursive level, but also with important material groundings and implications. And as I see it, central to decolonizing development is precisely the need to, on the one hand, make visible and challenge these implicit references which are constitutive of the development enterprise, and which are also often abstracted from the social context in which they emerged. And on the other hand, to make visible other possible reference, right? Which is where I think the question of thinking about research practice and methodology really matters. But there are several inspiring ways in which this can be done. So there is an extensive literature on this that I think is fascinating and inspiring. By situating the history of development in relation to colonial and imperial projects, as several scholars have done, by seeking to theorize development from different non-Western or non-Eurocentric vantage points, by interrogating and problematizing colonial histories and assumptions that shape the foundation of disciplines that are influential for development thinking, like Carolina is doing in development economics, by thinking through how decolonial ethic and engaged scholarship can help us make sense and confront intersecting socio-ecological crises, like Paula does in her work, by examining the ways in which racialized difference is mobilized, in particular development projects and constructions of risk, as Elias Lamy and Vicent German have done in relation to development finance specifically, by thinking development education through critical pedagogy and reflexivity, as Farhana Sultana has called for. So that goes on. There's several potential pathways for this. So I guess drawing on my own experience, my particular focus here will be on this question of how we conduct research and the potential for collaborative research to center other reference while also potentially decentering our very academic roles as producers of knowledge. And here I kind of share Carolina's concern with, a perception that sometimes decolonial scholarship or the language of decolonial scholarship can be a bit alienating and not necessarily, very engaged with practice. So I think if the goal is to decolonize, it is not enough for us as academics to theorize development from elsewhere without asking on what basis we can claim to speak from a different location or for others or for the rest, or without being open to different methodologies and ways of knowing, or without considering the many ways in which research practices can themselves be quite extractive and colonial, even when they are founded on or oriented by progressive goals. And I think Jenna has raised similar concerns in the paper that she's written with Jasmine Diani on colonialism and knowledge production in international relations as well. So I think this is about, among many different things, but the practicality of it is, how do we engage with diverse actors in ways that are substantive and non-tokenistic? How do we compensate them for their time or for their labor? How we co-produce outputs of research so that knowledge and the capital that is derived from knowledge production is not concentrated on us as academics necessarily. So there are several ways to think about this that we can discuss further. And I can't claim to have resolved any or all of those issues in my own work or the research that I engage in. And I also don't think it's possible for us to fully resolve them. And here I think of Audre Lorde saying that revolution is not a one-time thing, right? It is a continuous process of struggle, of reflection, and exercising awareness. But if anything, those questions have been really central to a collaborative action research project that I now co-lead with Catherine D'Ignazio at the Data First Feminist Lab, with Silvana Fumega at the Latin American Open Development Initiative, and with Helena Soares Val, who is an activist scholar who also leads the project Feminicídio Uruguay. And this project is called Data Against Feminicide. As part of this project, for the past 3 years, we've engaged with dozens of activists and civil society groups from South to North America, and elsewhere in the globe also, who monitor and produce data about feminicide or femicide. That's the terminology that is used in some other contexts. Feminicide is the gender-related killing of women and girls, including cisgender and transgender women. And building on lineages of activism and scholarship on feminicide, we also understand it as an intersectional and transversal form of violence, where gender subordination is interlinked with economic violence, with colonial histories, with racial oppression. And I can speak more about project later. I know we have a question about how examples of how we might do these kinds of things in practice. But I think what I wanted to highlight is that at the core of this work is a concern with making visible power asymmetries in data production and structural inequalities embedded in data, challenging expert hierarchies in knowledge production, embracing pluralism by centering the experiences and the practices and needs of diverse activists and organizations. So inspired by these principles, we've been working in collaboration with them to develop tools, digital tools that can support rather than replace the monitoring labor that they do. And I think, this kinds of reflections on methodology and practice and collaborative engagement, how can we do this on the ground, are really important, particularly in a field such as data science or big data or artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence, which we engage with in this work, which are also gaining increasing importance in everyday lives, in technocentric models of development, and amounting to what some scholars call a form of data colonialism as well. And we share concerns about datafication, about data extractivism, but we think it's possible, and we hope through this process, through this project, to enact a sort of different epistemology and ethic of research that challenges, this process of datafication, data extractivism, by taking power and people into account, by understanding how structural inequality produces missing and flawed data, and by supporting alternative data and knowledge practices that elevate other reference. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa. That was super. And I think, despite your highlighting the issue that, Carolina also noted about the challenges of linking decolonial work in academia to practice, I think you then laid out an amazing way in which you and other colleagues, I guess shout out also to my colleague, our colleague, Catherine D'Ignazio at MIT, have been doing. So that's great. And I think also plays in really nicely to some of the work that Paula is doing as well, without overly anticipating her work. So thanks very much, Isa, and Paula, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jason and Isa, for inviting me, and thank you, Carolina, also for your presentation, which is great. And I think this follows well from both the previous presentations. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who works in cultural studies, but also building on Latin American political ecology. So I'm not a development studies person, but I work with extractivism. And therefore, there is an undeniable connection there, because development is kind of at the heart of it. And I made some notes in response to the 3 questions that were circulated. So my bit is going to be perhaps a bit disjointed, because also as Carolina and Isa spoke, I have more ideas coming up, but hopefully it will still make sense. So with regards to the question of what it means to decolonize development in the fields of working, so first I would point out that if we're talking about the development project, like this kind of industry made up of multilateral organizations and financial organizations and countries and so on, I don't think we can decolonize it, because I think its purpose is to continue a relationship of domination. But if we're talking about the idea of planning and social transformation to improve the well-being of people, then yeah, I think the things that Isa pointed to, for instance, in terms of collaborative work, following and centering the voices of people in the territories, the knowledge of people in the territories, then yeah, I think there's a lot we can do, and that it starts with decentering Western ontologies, basically, and knowledge production. And that's where it relates to a lot of work that I do, which engages as well with political ontology. I look at the role of art and cultural production in the resistance to extractivism. Extractivism that is pushed, we could say, by the kind of development paradigm and modernization paradigm. And I'm concerned with deconstructing ontological underpinnings that restrain us from thinking and building and thinking worlds otherwise different to what we have now, to the capitalist extractivist system that we have. And in terms of doing this as an intellectual project, I think it's important also to know the politics of citation and whose work we build on and whose work we dialogue with. And I noticed from the outside that there's still a lot of development studies work that fails to properly engage with knowledge coming from the territories. So for me, as an Argentinian based in the UK, it is fundamental to engage with the voices of people doing research on the ground, because I feel like it's impossible to do this kind of research without engaging with that. And it might sound very obvious to those of you here, but it still somehow isn't to everyone. In terms of how we can think about decoloniality in relation to colonial and imperial histories in Latin America. So this is such an important question, and I think it took me a while to kind of choose which way to go with it, because there's so much that we can say. But given the current situation in Argentina, what I find politically most important to highlight today is how, first of all, there are multiple layers of coloniality in a country like Argentina, but also it's not a historical thing, it's like it's still happening today. And we can see it in the new frontier, which is lithium extraction. So as we speak, there is violent repression happening in the northwestern province of Jujuy, which is one of the places where there's lithium. And between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, there's about 65% of the world's currently extractable lithium, which is, as you know, the material that's needed for the energy transition. So it's a very contested issue, because it's presented as a future of clean energy and clean transport and so on. But so what's happening is that the provincial government in Jujuy just passed a constitutional reform. What's the word? Sorry, I can't think in English too. Kind of curtailing indigenous land rights, and also minimizing or basically banning rights to protest. In addition to other measures that basically make it easier for transnational companies to extract the lithium. There were protests against this, and they were met with brutal repression and illegal arrests. A teenager lost an eye as a result of the repression. And it's important because it kind of makes evident the violence of the so-called development, because by a lot of political actors, this is placed as the future, right? Like lithium, we have to be grateful that we have this resource that is going to fund the energy transition. But what's never discussed is how, for whom, for what is this lithium going to just go to replacing fossil fuel powered cars by the same amount of electric cars? Is it going to fuel a transition in the global north at the cost of more violence and ecological destruction in the south? So it kind of, lays bare the violence at that kind of supposed development project and suppose, sustainability, a global sustainability project. What else? I think the kind of ongoing coloniality of development is also present in other ways in a country like Argentina. So Carolina kind of brought up in one of the slides, I think the IMF. And Argentina is a really good example of the power that the IMF can have in a country where literally the IMF has like an office in the central bank. It is a form of neo-coloniality, the kind of power and influence that these institutions can have in the way that a country develops or doesn't. So I think what we're talking about is an anti-colonial struggle when we're talking about alternatives to development. It's not just an economic, an alternative, but it's also an anti-colonial struggle, or it should be framed as one, it should be understood as one. And in terms of examples based on my work, so my most recent work was on the role of art in the struggles against extractivism. And I was interested, as I mentioned, in this political ontology dimension, starting from the understanding that many Latin American countries have a strongly ingrained imaginary of being providers of resource, nature, right? Like that's our role and that's our advantage in a way. And in Argentina, at least, the common discourse is that that's what's going to save us and eventually allow further stages of development and modernization. But evidence shows us, experience shows us that that hasn't been the case. And in fact, there are international interests to sustain that, that current extraction-centered economic model. So I'm interested in artworks that allow spaces for thinking ourselves otherwise and for breaking with those strongly ingrained imaginaries, colonial imaginaries, we could say. Now I moved on from the field of more kind of grassroots-based art to the field of the creative industries. And the reason for doing that is that it is a field where there's a different logic to community arts or even to much of the visual arts. In the visual arts and the community arts, issues around extractivism have for long been debated. There's a lot of work going on around this. There's a common understanding that we need to transition away from this. And there's a common understanding of the environmental crisis is not just climate change and not an issue of energy transition, but rather something more profound that requires a radical social transformation. Whereas in the creative industries, and I'm talking about things like the music industry, design, film, well, it depends according to the country, the definition of creative industries, because interestingly enough, in Argentina, at least, what's usually used is the UK definition. And much of the creative and cultural industries policy in the country is derived from the UK. So a kind of copy-paste exercise, which obviously is quite problematic. And they operate under a different logic, commercial logic, which faces different challenges. In a country where there's a constant economic crisis, it's difficult to pose the question of, okay, what should creatives and cultural workers be doing in response to the environmental crisis? So do I have like 2 more minutes? Sorry, I forgot to keep track. Yeah, oh, thank you. I don't want to overstep. With a colleague at the Universidad de 3 de Febrero, a university in the province of Buenos Aires, we came together to start this project working with creative sector workers from different parts of the country to come together and talk about how we can design a territorialized, response to the socio-environmental crisis from an Argentinian and Latin American perspective. And we did a workshop, a kind of laboratory, two-day laboratory in June, which was very interesting. And it was quite experimental because we thought, okay, it might be that this is not the time to talk about this. It might be that we're facing so many obstacles. The sector is facing so many obstacles that this is not a concern that people can address. But actually, there was a lot of there were a lot of commonalities amongst people working in different sectors that actually had a concern for the socio-environmental crisis and that really wanted to develop an approach that was intersectional and that it was related to addressing all of the other crises that we face, from institutional violence to racism to financial limitations, and also trying to resist the implementation of standards, ways of measuring and objectives that are importing from the global north. So there was a shared awareness that we're often imitating the initiatives from England and other similar countries, when in fact the reality of the creative sector is completely different in a place like Argentina. So that's a way in which we're trying to decolonize, in a way we could say, cultural production and hopefully at some point cultural policy, and trying to work with sector actors to develop contextualized and territorialized approaches. It's very early stages, but we'll see where it goes. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Super, thanks so much, Paula. So I thought I'd just maybe make two comments here, just drawing on our colleague Jenna Marshall, who's not here's work, which I think ties in both to Paula's presentation just now, as well as Carolina and Isa's earlier in two ways. So Jenna shared a paper with me, which from which these ideas are going to be drawn from. The paper is entitled Decolonizing Political Economy Through or Alongside the Plantation, Contributions of the New World Group and the Caribbean Artist Movement. And so the two kind of key, I think, interventions that Jenna is making in this paper is, on one hand, the New World Group, which is a group of political economists in and from the Caribbean who wrote around the period of the late 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. So really at a similar time to when we saw a lot of the kind of structuralist work coming out of Latin America, that's really formed the basis of how a lot of us, obviously see the sort of neo-Marxist, independentista sort of intellectual movements in Latin America at that time. So these are people like Lloyd Best, Norman Garvan, etc. And one of their interventions, the key intervention that they make, and as Jenna highlights in her paper, was around this idea of the plantation economy. That is, using the plantation, which of course is the basis for the sort of emergence of the modern Caribbean political economy under colonialism, as an intellectual basis for thinking about the sort of structural relationship between Caribbean countries and the global economy. So very much aligned in many ways with dependency theory, but highlighting the sort of specific structures of the plantation itself as partly agrarian, partly industrial, the way in which it's racialized, and so forth, in thinking about its connection to the global economy, as well as highlighting the sort of impact of the sort of export basis and export bias that's built into the sort of plantation model, and by extension, the model of development under late colonialism and early independence in the Caribbean. So this, I think, very much ties in with Carolina's presentation, of course, in thinking about the ways in which these economists at the time thought about these kinds of issues, but also want to jump to the second part of Jenna's paper, which is on the Caribbean artists movement. And here what she highlights, again, from thinkers going back to the 1970s, like Brathwaite and others, are ways in which a sort of internal critique where the plantation school economists, the New World Group, focus a lot on what Brathwaite refers to as the sort of outer plantation. So those are the kind of economic institutions that structured the plantation economy, and less on the inner plantation. So the sort of cultural, social dimensions of the sort of the plantation and sort of plantation life sort of more generally, And here I'm just going to read just 2 lines from her paper just to kind of elucidate this a bit further, where she says, while the plantation school, so I'll read just a couple lines just from the paper. So in short, the emerging theories from the 1940s to the 1970s illustrated a substantive Caribbean contribution to a critical development scholarship. This, in spite of their limitations. The issue of history, and Arthur Lewis, who Carolina, of course, mentions, disavowal of Caribbean historical narratives of dispossession and resistance were used to frame these emerging theoretical positions in the plantation school. However, what the Caribbean artists movement sort of suggests is that despite the plantation school's use of history, the issue of language was a major limitation. These scholars failed to take into account the importance of epistemology, relying predominantly on a Western genealogy of thought at the expense of an indigenous Caribbean national language. Thirdly, neo-Marx, so this again is the Caribbean artists on one hand in dialogue with the sort of Caribbean plantation school political economists. Thirdly, neo-Marxists continue to grapple with the contradictions, while neo-Marxists continue to grapple with the contradictions and omissions prevalent in the privileging of class and race or ethnicity, the predominant focus nevertheless was on the outer plantation, which in many ways elided scholarship that challenged the inner plantation, which for many was about cultural life and expression of the marginalized Afro-Caribbean population that otherwise could reveal a particular kind of local agency and creativity. This kind of scholarship would not only illuminate post-emancipation Caribbean cultures, but would also provide new insight into global space and time by combining closer attention to local experience with a broader, less binary analysis of geographic and economic relations in the global economy. So I just wanted to highlight those couple of things from Jenna's work, which I think tie in very nicely with some of the what we've heard across from our 3 roundtable participants. So here I just wanted to open up for conversation both across our panelists and with the rest of the group that is on Zoom. And I kind of want to invite one of my mini conference co-organizers, Zophia Edwards, to pick up in particular on one of the things that we highlighted in the questions, which is how to think about the relationship between decolonial activities in the academy and what is happening on the ground with some examples from the Caribbean. So Zophia, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And thank you to all of my co-organizers for this mini conference, and to the panelists for a really rich discussion about decolonizing development, decolonizing economics. I'm really looking forward to when we open up a lot more broadly and hearing from other people as well. So my comments might be not very coherent, but there are some things that I've been thinking about recently with respect to the recent wave of calls to decolonize different disciplines and decolonize development, and sort of what is going on in the Caribbean and sort of outside of the global north. So this, of course, we know calls to decolonize development and decolonize economics. This struggle has been a very long one. But this recent move, this recent wave, I think there's been an outburst of it in sort of what we might think of as the metropole, right? It's coming largely from within North American, settler colonial and European, within the European Academy. There's some of it happening also, I think, in South Africa. But I would argue that you don't find this language, this thrust, right, at this present historical moment coming from the populace outside of the metropole, coming from elsewhere in the periphery. It's being mainly articulated in sort of, institutions where we are operating, right? And conferences that we're going to, like this one, which are kind of embedded in sort of the metropolitan areas. So what is the thrust in the academy outside of the metropole? I will focus on the Caribbean because that's where I'm from and where I have sort of an immediate knowledge about. But Caribbean academics are part of a mobilization for reparations. And the Caribbean reparations movement, which is organized by CARICOM, is a social movement. Of course, it has a much longer history than this very present moment, but it is articulating a legal, moral, and ethical case for the payment of reparations by governments of former colonial powers and relevant institutions, including institutions of higher education, to those people of the Caribbean community for the crimes of indigenous genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and racist chattel slavery. So like calls to decolonize universities and education systems and curricula, mobilizing for reparations has a long history that's rooted in the anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-imperial struggle. I think that decolonial-minded scholars in the metropole today would support and do support the reparations movement. And scholars, Caribbean scholars today obviously support these calls to decolonize this and that in, as it's being articulated in the metropoles. But I would argue that these two conversations are happening largely separately. And on the road, if we can think of on the road to decolonizing, because other presenters have already said this is a process, it's not an event, it's ongoing. So on the road to decolonizing development, how might we bring these two movements into conversation with each other? Is there a fruitful intersection potentially here that we might explore? And what might we gain from bringing these two conversations together? I think the project of decolonization, dismantling colonialism, the pursuit of freedom, independence, autonomy, self-determination, is intimately linked with reparations, and universities in former colonies are key sites for reparations. Of course, with limitations. I mean, we might talk about what the limitations could be in the Q&A, but I think that bringing these two conversations or these two movements together might be generative in three main ways. First, I think it will help to address the material and guard against the coloniality of the decolonizing conversations. Or decolonizing projects. It will help us to recenter the struggle to decolonize as a struggle against capitalism, and help us to elevate the demands of communities outside of the metropole. So just very quickly, first, with respect to the material, I think there are, a lot of the work on decolonizing different disciplines has been so generative for pointing out the epistemological underpinnings of various different disciplines and the need to correct this epistemological injustice. We have, just in this conversation here, so many scholars who are doing this work. The focus has been on how we might correct these exclusions, how we might reshape the paradigms, reinvent or rethink methodologies and transform our understandings. And so in thinking about correcting knowledges and ideas, how can we pair attention to the fact that this knowledge is produced out of an infrastructure where wealth and status is accruing in one place through the active dispossession and extraction of wealth in other places. So thinking about repairing historical wrongs epistemologically, but also materially in terms of the structures that advantage researchers in the core and disadvantage those in the peripheries, in the peripheralized regions. And I think that this movement for material reparations helps us to address this harm in tangible ways. The reparations movement in the Caribbean, for example, is demanding the development of community institutions such as museums and research centers, African-based knowledge programs, technologies transfer, and scientific sharing or science sharing. So these are ways that decolonizing methodologies, decolonizing knowledge productions and buildings and so on can be linked with the material corrections as well that obviously need to happen if we are really going to have a serious discussion about sort of rectifying inequalities. Some reparations money, for example, from the University of Glasgow are going towards the establishing a Glasgow Caribbean Center for Development Research to study the history and global impact of slavery. And so these are some real concrete ways in which resources are being channeled, you know, resources that were taken historically are trying to be rechanneled back into the Caribbean. Just very quickly, I think also decolonization or thinking about decolonization through reparations also helps us to recenter the system of capitalism. One of the panelists already, Carolina already kind of addressed sort of the disconnect that often happens when we think about decolonization as divorced from capitalism. But the thrust around the matter is that, you know, decolonizing development, decolonizing these different disciplines is linked to the historical establishment of and maintenance of capitalist social relations. And so it's very, very possible, right, for these calls to decolonize this and that to exist quite harmoniously in the capitalist neoliberal university. And so how might we rethink those relations? The Caribbean reparations movement gives us some really great tools for doing that. It's not about valuing lives. It's not about compensation or inclusion or representation. Rather, it is about challenging the very terms of racial and colonial, whatever you want to call it, capitalism. It's about justice and transformation, about securing funds to build Black and Indigenous institutions for Black and Indigenous people, including investing in research that benefits the masses. So it's not just an intellectual project, it's about survival and about thriving. In the early days of independence, universities were seen as sites, primary sites in former colonies, trying to repair the harm done to people, of course, with many problems. But we might think about these places as incubators for designing new, not just understandings of historical development, but building new futures. And just finally, bringing the conversation of reparations into discussions of decolonization elevates the voices of those who are marginalized today It allows for efforts to decolonize different disciplines in the metropoles to forefront those who are organizing to make similar overlapping claims in the periphery. And so we might think more carefully about sort of to what extent can you produce decolonial anti-capitalist thought in the capitalist universities in the core, who's getting visas to do that work, who gets to produce that knowledge. So we might think about all of those things. And as we think about reparations in correcting a lot of that. So I will just, I'll just put those ideas out there and, you know, and in having this conversation, pushing us to think about decentering and destabilizing as well as redistribution. So what is required to reverse 500 years of history to make a new world? And so where might reparations fall into that? Thank you.